Shalom, shalom. Peace be with you, peace be upon you. May you receive abundant blessings from the Most High God through this video. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we came across an extraordinary book. We really, really liked it. We read a few chapters of it and found it awesome. By Rabbi Daniel Silver, who is a nationally renowned rabbi. He passed in 2015. Who followed in the footsteps of his legendary father, Rabbi Daniel Silver, as the temple Tifereth, Israel's spiritual leader. The father and son led the temple as senior rabbis for a combined 72 years. The main sanctuary at the Temple's University Circle building in Cleveland was renamed the Silver Memorial Sanctuary in their memory in 1990. The temple paid tribute to the life and legacy of Rabbi Daniel Silver, the senior rabbi from 1963 to 1989, May 15 to 16, about 2015 in Beechwood. Someone here says they didn't know him personally, but they knew of his monumental reputation. Rabbi Richard A. Block, the temple's senior rabbi. In 14 years as senior rabbi, he learned a great deal about him and his enduring legacy at the temple. He felt a powerful sense of responsibility and privilege to be the successor to Rabbi Daniel Silver, and before him his father. Each in their own way had a phenomenal rabbinate. So these people have got great things to say about both of them, especially Rabbi Rosetta Baron Haim, the longest serving congregational rabbi in Greater Cleveland, who joined the temple's clergy in June 1988 when Rabbi Daniel Silver appointed her assistant rabbi. She worked under him for about 18 months until his death. And she states, when she came, he was really ill. He had a brain tumor, said Haim, a member of the Cleveland Jewish News Board of Directors. For a man who was so intellectually oriented and so bright and articulate, it was really such a tragedy. He was a very strong man, still very physically imposing, and he still composed articulate, powerful sermons. His whole life was dedicated to scholarship and being a pastor for their congregation. And another person said he was like quite a hard man at times. He was very open-minded to a lot of different political issues of the times. He could be very imposing and intimidating, but he also could be very gracious. He said, this is East Stone, a member of the Temple Tifereth Israel, who worked for 4 years under Silver. He could be very imposing and intimidating, but he also could be very gracious, she said. He set a great example for her as a rabbi. On her first day of work, he told her he wanted to know what she wanted to study, and he would pay for it, but he insisted that she study. You couldn't be a rabbi unless you studied. That set a tone for her rabbinate. That continues to this day, and so forth. And Haim said Silver's widow Adele, who lives in Washington, and his 3 grandchildren and his spouses would be coming in for the weekend probably for that funeral in 2015, or that memorial. So we're going to look at that book, the story of Scripture, and we're looking specifically at the languages used once they decided to commit it to scrolls, parchment scrolls. For centuries they had passed it on verbally or orally, and people memorized it, etc., etc. But somebody decided, we'll put it to parchment. And linguistically, Aramaic is a near cousin. Here we go, up a bit further up at the top. After 550 BCE, the new Persian administration, because don't forget they were in Babylon as exiles, and they couldn't do their religious traditions, customs, etc. So they were very depressed, saddened, i.e. they sat by the river of Babylon and they wept because they couldn't do their traditions, their customs, their religious rites, etc. But God commissioned Cyrus the Persian to go rescue them, bring them out of enslavement, and he's a type of savior, not the Messiah, but symbolically God used him as a Messiah or a savior, in a sense to bring them out of exile and into his land, the Aramaic, who was specially commissioned by God to do so. And then they were given that right to practice their religion, their customs, their traditions, etc. And he even said he would pay for them to go and supply the equipment, the tools, etc. to rebuild the temple at Jerusalem, which was destroyed, and so forth. And here it states, after 550 BC, the new Persian administration established Aramaic as the language of record for all documents dealing with government matters and commerce in the western part of the empire, and adopted a formal script for official use. So this Aramaic may have been Persian of origin, right? Established Aramaic, or else this is the language that Aram in the Bible spoke, their forefather, the Arameans spoke. Okay, so he re-established it by the sounds of it, or established it as the language of record for all documents dealing with government matters and commerce in the western part of the empire, and adopted a formal script for official use. This script of squarish design, far more readable than cuneiform influenced predecessors, because it's really hard. Only the elites, the professionals, the experts could read and write it properly. It was like so difficult. It was quickly adopted by Judean scribes. Recognizing its eastern origins, they named this new script, somewhat anachronistically, Asherit, the Assyrian script. It later became, and remains to this day, the standard for all liturgically approved Torah scrolls. Linguistically, Aramaic is a near cousin to Hebrew. Well, Victor N. Alexander, translator of the original ancient very old Tav Asherit, Syrian Aramaic, etc. Native-born Aramaic-speaking translator, filmmaker from Bet Narain or Mesopotamia, Syria, actually says it's the older sister of the Hebrew. It came before the Hebrew. It's like the sacred scribal tongue of God, etc. The languages both related to Akkadian, that's the Aramaic and Hebrew, and they share many words, employ essentially the same grammatical forms, and are written with the same alphabet. Bilingualism became increasingly common. By the time Alexander the Great's conquest ended the Persian period, late 4th century BCE, Aramaic was well on its way to becoming the vernacular of most Judeans. The priest scribe who sometime in the 4th century prepared a history of the reforms, Ezra, had instituted in Jerusalem a chronicle included in the Bible, felt comfortable introducing into his history several untranslated Aramaic documents purportedly issued by the Persian Imperial Bureau, Ezra's 486-18, 7:12-26. The increased use of Aramaic, particularly by elite, literate Judeans, increasingly allowed these former provincials to feel themselves part of an international literary world. The exiles found Aramaic a useful, even indispensable tool in maintaining contact between them and their hosts. The increased use of Aramaic also exerted an unplanned pressure towards the creation of a Hebrew scripture. As more and more Judeans used Aramaic as a vernacular, the number who could readily understand recitations of the tradition diminished, and a bilingual audience, Hebrew and Aramaic, began to impose subtle but important changes on the traditional language in which the Torah and the narratives were presented. While the need to be understood dictated linguistic change, there was at the same time a predictable conservative reaction determined to preserve familiar idioms or forms of expression and language. One way to accomplish such preservation was to fix the material in written form. The population at large was, as it had always been, dependent on professional memorizers and reciters. Since fewer and fewer of the traditional Hebrew forms and idioms were part of everyday speech, even reciters began to refer to notes. This language shift tended to reduce significantly the average listener's ability to remember text with a full complement of original phrases and cadences. Understanding the reciter less, the audience exerted less influence on the storyteller, who in turn gave his recitations more by rote. There is a law of cultural transfer that the more endangered annual repertoire, the greater the felt pressure to record it. Memorization became for many a self-conscious effort. The tradition would have lost all sense of being tradition had people used translations to bridge this growing sense of distance from the original material. Fortunately, they made no such attempt. To translate the tradition into Aramaic would have vitiated its power, which in the popular mind derived as much from its ancient phrases as from the ideas it contained. On the level of popular faith, the issue was not accuracy or understanding. The issue was not accuracy or understanding, but the people's belief that the language of tradition possessed special power. Language is an essential element of tradition, and the best translation can only approximate the meaning and style of the original. Greek rhapsodists continued to recite the Iliad in the classic tongue long after Demotic Greek had become the vernacular of their audiences, who, though they no longer fully understood the words, recognized familiar cadences and most of all responded to the symbolic power of the words. In the Middle Ages, Muslim scholars routinely taught that a translation of the Quran was no longer Quran, and in modern times, non-Arabic speaking Muslims in far places like Malaysia and Indonesia, where Arabic is little known, are routinely set the task of memorizing the Quran in the original. Pre-Islamic Hebrew, the ordinary vernacular of the tribes and the language in which the sagas had been formed, now begins its measured ascent into the status of Lashon HaKodesh, holy speech. Hebrew took on a gravity and weight it had not enjoyed when it was simply the people's speech. A cloak of holiness was spread over whatever was written or spoken in the classic speech. The old words were seen as heavy with power. Since Hebrew had been the language in which the prophets had reported God's message, it followed that God spoke in Hebrew. Praise of Hebrew as a divine tongue would become a stock element of the rabbinic tradition. Our Hebrew language is called the Holy Tongue because the Holy One brought it into being. Its words are not accidental but the result of a wondrous design and sublime wisdom based on profound mysteries and meanings. Dalmatigo, 1631. Over the centuries and until quite recently, Jews have found it difficult, though there are exceptions, to revere any work, however learned or pious, that was not written in Hebrew. Victine Alexander, native-born Aramaic speaker, translator, filmmaker, would say no. The original ancient, very old Aramaic was the older sister language. The Lishana Artica Sapraya being the scribal language of God, that God spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden, and that the men at the Tower of Babel spoke one to each other. So people have their differences there, right? One will say it was the Hebrew, one will say it's the Aramaic. Or one will say it's the Aramaic, the other will say it's the Hebrew. It came first, originally, etc., etc. And we're going to jump to page 140 for more. Shall we start? Okay. Not all contemporary lists of venerated scrolls are identical or even complete. The Greek-speaking diaspora developed its own table of contents, known as the Septuagint. The sectarians at Qumran also developed their own consensus over several hundred years. There was as yet no agreed on formal method for the presentation of venerated writings. Most scrolls were set out in the new square script, or Asheret, Kitab Asheret or Tav Asheret, but others continued to be written in the older Tav or Kitab Ivri. Still, the scrolls had achieved a recognizable role in the life of the community. Among the scribes and those who cared, there was now heightened interest in establishing a correct text. Many questions of orthography, spelling, and word division were resolved. Versions were compared and decisions made. Issues of particular concern included syntax, spelling, word division, and pagination. as well as scribal glosses or corrections which he had mistakenly entered into the body of the text, often resulting in a conflating reading. The use of Greek and Aramaic. Koine, the popular Greek dialect, became the vernacular of the large Egyptian Syrian diaspora and was even spoken by some in Judea. Jews who could write and read Greek could take advantage of Greek books and culture. Perhaps Koine's widespread use was one of the reasons literary interest was more highly developed in the diaspora than in Judea. The knowledge of everyday Greek was, however, no guarantee that a person could read the Iliad or Plato in the classic tongue. Philo's Catholic knowledge, or universal knowledge, of the classic Hellenistic curriculum was, as far as we know, unique among diaspora Jews, but there can be little doubt that the intelligentsia of the large Jewish community of Alexandria had access to that city's libraries and were influenced by Greek literary forms and interests, and even by the contents of the Greek classics, like the Iliad, Plato, etc. By the 2nd century BCE, there is little doubt that most diaspora Jews could no longer speak or understand Hebrew. For a Greek-speaking Jew to have mastered the Hebrew text would have been a significant accomplishment, requiring learning not only an unfamiliar alphabet, but also the sound of a language rarely heard or used. Greek translations were an absolute necessity. Despite the claim of the letter of Aristeas that the Ptolemaic court had ordered the Septuagint translations, there is little, if any, evidence that the Greeks of West Asia were interested enough in the sacred literature of their Oriental subjects to have any of it translated. This was a task for Jews. Hebrew was losing out on all fronts. Aramaic was becoming the vernacular of Jews in Judea, as Koine was for Egyptian and Syrian Jews. An editor of the priestly history has Nehemiah say that on arrival in Jerusalem he found among its citizens many whose children spoke the language of Asher, i.e. the Asherite, and could no longer speak the language of Judah. Nehemiah 13:24. One of several texts that point to the spread of Aramaic as a vernacular among the Jews in Judea. Besides the Aramaic material that found its way into the Bible, Aramaic texts found at or near Qumran include fragments of a prayer ascribed to the Babylonian king Nabonidus, sections of Tobit, Enoch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a translation of Job, and the Genesis Apocryphon. There is also in Aramaic a Megillat Ta'anit, a small scroll listing 36 days on which fasting is prohibited, which some scholars regard as a document of a rebel party fighting Rome, apparently written in haste and for popular consumption, shortly before the temple's destruction in 70 CE. Josephus wrote the text of the Jewish wars in Aramaic and then arranged for its translation into Greek. In a Greek introduction. The use of Hebrew. Despite the dethronement of Hebrew as the national vernacular, schooling and custom ensured that familiar hymns, stories, phrases, and idioms in the old speech remained part of an active universe of discourse, but the oral tradition in its original form was no longer of a piece with the community's daily speech, a change that served to spur interest in written text. As contemporary culture no longer reinforced the classic tradition, the study of Hebrew text increasingly became the preserve of a segment of a literate elite who increasingly, and sometimes without consciously planning it, found themselves determining and shaping tradition through their ability to interpret the revered text. Any text requires interpretation if only to put the bare words in some appropriate context. Who but a well-informed commentator could provide that understanding? Those who knew Hebrew were obviously the only ones who could provide background and context, and also derive from the text written in Hebrew new levels of meaning. During late Hellenistic times, Hebrew became for Judean intellectuals what Latin was for Europe's best and brightest during the Middle Ages, a proof of status, a means of self-conscious academic communication, and the basis of a claim to religious authority. Men wrote in Hebrew for many of the same reasons, but particularly to associate their words with God's speech, to dress them in holiness. The temple scroll, Jubilees, and the Pesha on Habakkuk were written in Hebrew. So was the wisdom of Ben Sirah, so were Tobit and Judith. But the existence of a work in Aramaic was not a compelling reason for exclusion. The Aramaic portions of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, or a work in Hebrew for inclusion, Ben Sirah, Judith, and Tobit. One bit of evidence from rabbinic times of the synagogue's emergence as Mikdash Me'at, a small sanctuary possessing some of the redemptive power once associated with the temple, was a deliberate retention of some Hebrew in the worship service and the requirement of public readings from the scrolls in the original Hebrew. Theoretically, one could pray in any language. There were Aramaic and Greek prayers, but the sense of power and mystery associated with Hebrew tended to outweigh more practical considerations. Hebrew was, for the most part, deliberately kept alive in the house of prayer. Much of the power implicit in the liturgy lay in the participants' use of God's language. Hebrew was the language which God had addressed Israel and in which Israel felt it proper to address God. Though it is not generally considered in this light, the rabbinic ritual of Kiryat HaTorah, reading the Torah as part of synagogue worship for which every male was trained, was shaped to be a rite of communion. A reader reads God's own phrases in God's own tongue. Here's the beginning of liturgy. The Jew worshipped his God in a special way. In pre-exilic times, the Levitical choirs recited psalms for liturgical purposes in the shrines. The Shema and a few other rubrics were already well known. In its first stages, the rubric was simple. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So God spoke, they listened. In concise parallel phrases that taught the Jew theology, God is singular, God is active in our history, in our lives, and near to us. Later, the rubric was built on and became far more complex. Torah readings added commands. It added commands to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and petitions asking for a quiet and confident trust in God's redemptive power. The history of Jewish liturgy is a history of accumulation. The Levites had sung their psalms in Hebrew, which became the language of worship. Prayers were also in the first person plural. These characteristics, the deliberate use of Hebrew and a collective expression of faith, meant that the liturgy was shared by all Jews, whatever vernacular they spoke and whatever community they lived in. It made the liturgy independent of circumstance and history and served all Jews equally wherever they went. By the end of the 2nd century CE, a fixed form and fixed order of prayers had been established, reflecting the growing authority of the sages. At first, the prayers were not written down, the specific wording was not yet defined, but their general content was known and accepted. So that's a little bit of information from the story of scriptures, defining the first scripture, the Torah, page 110, 140 onwards, in regards to the ancient original Hebrew and also ancient original Aramaic languages, possibly one used for prayers, etc. inside the temple, the other, the Aramaic, used outside for every other, like day-to-day speech and so forth. We hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and then share this with your family, friends, and neighbours and others, because this is a really, really good book. One we are looking at actually had information here on the Asherit, like had page references and information about the Tav Asherit, the Tav Ivri, etc. We don't know what happened to that. Yeah, we may use a snapshot to show you, but you don't know what happened to it. It was there, then it just disappeared. Second time around recording. Okay, so if you like this video, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a thumbs up. Add your comments down below and get back to you on those as soon as we can. And go share this with all your family, friends, and